over the last 24 hours, the administration now signaling that they're considering doubling the 10% tariff increase to as much as 25% on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. Your thoughts?
Well, first of all, I'm pleased with what I've heard about the fact that we're talking again. I think we have to be talking to China directly in order to get a resolution to this issue. Having this tariff escalation is not good for us. I can't imagine it's good for China. Yesterday I had a constituent come in my office who makes a finished product here in the United States with a raw material from China. They are now saying that because of the tariffs, the finished product will now come from China, which, by the way, does not have a tariff on it, whereas the raw material does. So there are lots of administrative issues that are rising up in Ohio, not just higher tariffs, but companies that are literally saying they can't compete so long as we don't resolve this tariff issue. So we need to resolve it. On the other hand, China is not playing by the rules. And I applaud the administration for calling that out and for using
especially on intellectual property.
Especially on intellectual property, but it's more than that. I mean, there are structural reforms that are needed in terms of the ability of a U.S. company to do business in China. That's not necessarily an intellectual property issue, but it is a joint venture requirement that for many sensitive industries, particularly, you have to have a Chinese partner that has a majority of the shares. We don't require that here. That's a question of reciprocity. The taking of intellectual property, including manufacturing processes, allows them to leapfrog us. That's not fair. So there are things that we do need to do to change the trade relationship in a structural way. So I'm really glad these talks are getting underway again, because what we were seeing was escalating tariffs on both sides and no discussion. So we need to resolve these issues, and the way you do that is through talks.
Prior to serving in the Senate, you, of course, were the top trade representative in the Bush administration. You've also been outspoken about how these trade talks are impacting agriculture in your state, particularly with farmers. Do you think the aid package that the administration announced last week is going to do enough to alleviate some of your concerns?
We don't know the details of it, who's going to get it, how it's going to be distributed. I will say, having been with a bunch of farmers last weekend, and I'll be back home in Ohio again this weekend, people want trade. They don't want aid, as they say. Trade, not aid. And what that means is farmers aren't looking for a handout. They're looking for the ability to sell their products overseas. And ultimately, the objective, I hope, of these China discussions is to open markets more. China does buy a lot of soybeans from Ohio, and it's our number one market. And we want to get it back, because by not having that market, prices are depressed. But on the other hand, a lot of other products are not getting into China the way China has access to our market. Again, question of reciprocity, leveling that playing field, not manipulating their currency. One thing that China has been doing over the past decades has been lowering the value of their currency to make their exports more competitive here in the United States and make our imports to China, into China, more expensive. That's not fair either.
With regards to soybeans, you talk about China, the administration saying that they're trying to open up some of the markets in the EU. What do you make of that? Do you think that's an adequate approach, particularly if the Chinese are going to play hardball on things like soybeans?
Well, it's good to open markets in the EU, no question about it. The comments from the EU after the discussions last week with President Juncker were not encouraging, because they were saying that agriculture might not be a significant part of the talks. It should be. The EU has a number of protectionist measures on agricultural products. Most of them are not tariffs. They're what are called non-tariff barriers. Everything from beef and beef hormones to poultry and how it's processed to corn and soybeans and GMOs are effectively kept out of the European market using phytosanitary standards, which are really another form of protectionism in my view. So, yeah, we should be opening up the European market for sure. By the way, it would be very good for Europe to have access to some of our agricultural products to lower their cost of living, and it would be a win-win, I think, for both sides.
I was struck last week at the White House when Prime Minister Conte of Italy was talking with President Trump, and he said the Russia sanctions are staying. Your thoughts? You've advocated for more sanctions against Russia.
Yeah, I was very encouraged to see that, and I'm glad the Prime Minister made that point, because I think Italy has been one of those countries that some have been concerned about, that there might be an EU consensus that could be shattered by the Italians joining some other countries and ending the sanctions.
And do you think President Trump is moving in the right directions with regards to Russia sanctions, or do you want to see him do more?
Well, obviously we need to do more, because what we're doing isn't working. Or do what we're doing more effectively, target it better. Russia is still violating the rules. They refuse to deal with Crimea, which they illegally annexed. They continue on the eastern border of Ukraine to foment a hot conflict that is killing Ukrainian soldiers on Ukrainian soil. Russians are actively involved. We know that now. They continue to meddle in elections, not just our election, which of course is the basis for a lot of these.
But all over Europe.
But all over Eastern Europe,
and
Central Europe.
Let me follow up on this point of that in particular, because just within the last day, Facebook now saying that they have proof of outside groups trying to influence even the midterms, and there's even been more reports. I mean, are we doing enough to protect our midterm elections? Are social media companies doing enough to protect our elections?
Well, no. I mean, we need to do more. And, Congress has appropriated an unprecedented amount of money, $380 million, to help the states to be able to be better prepared to deal with it. And that's important. But it goes beyond just the state boards of elections. We need to be sure that we are pushing back against the propaganda, the disinformation. There is a group at the State Department called the Global Engagement Center, GEC, which is now up and running. This is legislation that a Democrat and I have been pushing the last few years. I commend Secretary Pompeo because he's actually using this tool. And the idea there is to push back against the disinformation, and that should help in our elections. The actual fake news, including in these fledgling democracies in Central and Eastern Europe, and not just Ukraine, but all across Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and even obviously they've tried to affect the elections in places like France and Germany and the UK. So we need to help to push back against that in a more effective way.